On this view, one point of God's giving human beings laws and leaving the enforcement of those laws to human beings is not the effect of the system on the violators of the law, but the effect of the system on the people entrusted with enforcing the law. At the point in the biblical story at which God commands the destruction of the Amalekite people, the Israelite people is early in its history of formation as a people with a law. And so we might bring to bear on the story of the Amalekites considerations analogous to those about the divinely given law and the enforcement of that law. Just as in the world of the biblical stories and in the world of my thought experiment, there's a point to making human beings responsible for a law God gives them. So it is not implausible to suppose that making the Israelite people responsible for God's eradicating the Amalekite people brings home to the Israelite people the moral and religious importance of God's judgment and the importance of the Israelite people's commitment to God. Saul is the first king of the Israelite people, who are at that point in the transition from being a loosely knit aggregate of tribes to being one people bound together in a nation. Their short history between their coming out of Egypt and their coming together as a nation under a king is marked by reiterated episodes of alienation from God and disregard of the moral and spiritual practices God enjoined on them during the Exodus. Here, at the beginning of their existence as a nation, it may be that God commands them to be the agents of the destruction of the Amalekite people, to bring home to them in this drastic way the importance of their relationship to God and the importance of God's judgments, including the divinely ordained practices that distinguish the Israelite people from the surrounding peoples. Thinking about the story in this way helps to explain why God requires the Israelites to kill all the animals of the Amalekites. Animals represent wealth in this culture. If the Israelite people take the Amalekite animals for their own use, any use, even for use as sacrifices, then they begin to blur the distinction between acting as officially sanctioned executioners, as it were, and acting as brigands. And this way of interpreting the story, God commands the killing of all the Amalekite animals so that the Israelites do not make a profit from victory over the Amalekites. For the Israelite people to refrain from pillaging their defeated enemies is for them to be committed in a way they will feel to acting for God's purposes and not their own. Now I'm going to skip the next two paragraphs. But what about the issue of moral corruption? Moral corruption is a matter of making someone morally worse than he otherwise would be. And in principle, one people can certainly be corrupted by going to war to destroy another people it takes to be its enemy. But a lot depends on the condition of the people engaged in the fighting. In the world of the stories, as evidenced by biblical text, and in the ancient Western world in general, as attested by such sources as we have in history and poetry, unending tribal warfare marked by savage practices is the rule in the time when God gives the Israelite people the command to destroy the Amalekites. In the period immediately before the story about Samuel and the Amalekites, the Israelites attacked the Amalekites on their own authority, not God's. In this same period, they also fought with the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, and the Philistines, all of whom at some point also aggressed against the Israelites. As for the surrounding peoples, when the Ammonites initiate an attack against one Israelite community, the Israelite people of that community cave. They offer to surrender without fighting and to serve the Ammonites exactly as the Ammonites wish. But the Ammonites are willing to accept that offer only if the Israelites first allow them to gouge out the right eye of every Israelite human being in that community. So it's less clear than it might have initially seemed that in the world of these stories, God's command to destroy the Amalekites risks the moral corruption of the Israelite people. Another way of reading the story about Samuel and the Amalekites, then, is to see God's aims as focused on the effects of the fighting on the Israelite people rather than on the Amalekite people. I do not mean to say that in the world of the biblical stories, any more than in the world of my thought experiment, God cares only about the Israelite people. I mean only that the books of the Hebrew Bible have the Israelite people and their growth in relationship to God as the main concern of the story. It isn't possible to tell everything in one story. I also do not mean, and it is also not part of my interpretation of the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, that in that story God uses the suffering of the Amalekites only for the sake of bringing any kind of benefit to the Israelites. In the world of my thought experiment, God loves all human persons, and he doesn't use the suffering of any human beings solely as a means to some good for others. In the world of my thought experiment, in some story we don't have, another one of the Abrahamic peoples, the Amalekites, and not the Israelites, are the main protagonists, and the point of their suffering is the provision of benefits for them. On this interpretation of the story, however, another perplexity arises, analogous to the one I raised for the interpretation of the story in which the point of the fighting is primarily the effect on the Amalekites. If God's purpose in the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, if his purpose has to do with the formation of the Israelites as a people growing in their ability to be united to him, it seems that his plan is as unreliable and unsuccessful as I said that plan would be if its aim were its effects on the Amalekites. That's because very shortly after this, the Israelite people is itself immersed in all the practices God has condemned on the part of all the surrounding peoples with whom God has commanded the Israelite people to fight. So it seems as if on the interpretation I've just given of the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, God's plan is no more efficacious or successful in achieving God's ends than it was on the interpretation of the story I was trying to put aside. Here it's worth thinking again of the other cases I mentioned in which God requires human agency. God's giving of the law prohibiting theft and murder, for example, and is requiring human enforcement of that law. Murder and theft were certainly not extinguished among the Israelite people by this means. Or think again about the story of Noah and the flood, which I said was the moral and spiritual equivalent of an autologous bone marrow transplant. In the case of Noah's flood, the procedure was a definite failure. The old moral disease returned almost immediately. The remission purchased by the flood was very short-lived. If God was hoping for a morally better world by means of killing off the morally diseased peoples of the antediluvian world, he was sadly mistaken. And now in the world of my thought experiment, we have reached another reductio. The God of my thought experiment couldn't be sadly mistaken. He's omniscient. And as omniscient, he will know that bringing a flood and eradicating all but a few good people will not solve the moral problem with the human species. Mutatis mutandis, the same point applies with regard to the God of the biblical stories. In the world of the biblical stories, God can predict things hundreds of years in advance, as when he tells Abraham that his descendants will be slaves for 400 years. So presumably the God of the biblical stories can also know what will happen in the life of a people 1 or 2 generations hence. Even in the world of the biblical stories, then, God can know that these plans will fail. So why would God bring about a flood? Why would God give the law? or ask the Israelite people to enforce it? Why would he command the eradication of the Amalekite people? In each of these cases, what looks like a plan to grow a people into a moral and spiritual condition that will enable them to be united with God turns out to be a failure. But this failure is one that could not be a surprise to the omniscient God of my thought experiment or to the God of the biblical stories either. It could, however, be a surprise to us. That is, for each of the things God does, start over with a new human people after the flood, set rules for the behavior of the Israelite people, get the Israelite people to be enforcers of those rules, command the Israelite people to act as officially sanctioned executioners against the whole people of the Amalekites. For each of these things, we might have thought that one or more of these plans would be an efficacious way to cure the moral disease that seems to infect all human beings everywhere. So here's a different way of understanding what God is doing in stories such as these in the Hebrew Bible. He's forming a people by showing them what will not work to cure them of what has to be healed in them in order for them to be united to God as a people. This way of thinking about God's plans yields another interpretation of the story about the Amalekites.